Hey everybody, finally got enough questions to do Q&A video too, so here you go. Remember to keep asking questions. I will not respond to review requests in Q&A videos, but you can still ask for them anyway. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Question from Droplant here. Why don't you videotape yourself when doing Q&As? I don't really feel like it, for one, and for another, I don't feel like getting the camera out. And for another, it's just easier for me to do this computer-based thing, where, you know, instead of just sitting there in front of a camera, stuttering and mumbling and all that kind of stuff, where you probably won't be able to understand what I'm saying, I can sit here and speak more clearly into the microphone. Aside from that, I'm not much to look at, so there you go for that. And another thing that's I've got a problem with my camera is that it's got batteries, and those batteries run out very easily, so you can't really get too much out of it. Anyway, let's keep going with one from Hapasai27, asking if the Wing Commander series should be relaunched. Because all sorts of other games are getting remade these days. You see like stuff like Bionic Commando, Splatterhouse, all these kind of things are getting remade. So it's like, imagine shooting kilrathis with state-of-the-art graphics and modern gameplay, and blah blah blah. No, it would suck. And the simple reason for that is that they wouldn't adhere to the old series. They would go for what sells. And what sells these days is extremely dumbed down game mechanics in flight games. So if you're going to be playing a Wing Commander game, and then all of a sudden you go to the, like, let's say they make a new one, it would be this horribly dumbed down, probably extremely stupid experience. Because we all know how they tend to screw up storylines anymore. But if they remade it well, then it might be okay. If they remade it pretty much exactly the same as the old series, except with better graphics and slightly streamlined controls, that might work okay. But if it was just completely dumbed down for the masses, then it would be a problem. Next one, Gunker1991 again. He's asking about real-life stuff. Feel free to ask real-life stuff if you want. What education or employment do you currently have? Currently don't have a job. I'm working on it, though. And as for education, I'm working my way through university. So that's pretty much the way that's going. And why I don't have much time to do Let's Plays and stuff anymore. SonyMan135 asks, and I'll do this one in the appropriate accent because of this. I got one. I'm very curious. Have you ever been to Ireland? I'm Irish and I'm just wondering if you've been there. If so, what county? Sorry, I haven't been to Ireland. I am part Irish, but I haven't been there. I have been to Germany, France, Liechtenstein, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy. But I have not made my way to the British Isles yet. And I do want to get there eventually, though. So, sorry I haven't been to Ireland, and therefore don't know any of the counties. Anyway, continuing, Japan Sato 00, how do you think was the best year in gaming history? That's, as terms of release years. And, this is a pretty tough one for me, because there's been a lot of really good years. But, as far as the, I'm going to go with the most influential, I guess I should say. And that would be 96. 1996 because of Quake. Now, Quake pretty much spearheaded the 3D revolution kind of thing. We suddenly went from, you know, the 2 and 2.5D stuff to 3D, at least polygonal 3D. And we'd had stuff like that before. We have the PlayStation that was released a year before. We'd had stuff like Star Fox on Super Nintendo, but it wasn't quite 3D. And on PS1, we didn't really have all that many 3D games until 96 and on. Because Quake spearheaded the 3D revolution, so all of a sudden everything had to be in 3D. So as far as influential years, it's probably 1996. As for best, most fun part of 96, I'd say Duke Nukem 3D. But anyway. Continuing on, AshEd65 asks, hey man, how come you don't like the PS3? It's not just PlayStation 3. I don't like PlayStation 1, 2, or PSP either. And the simple reason is the controls. They're terrible. And I know a lot of people will give me flack for this, and they'll say, oh, you can't be serious. This is the best controller ever. It hurts my hands to use the controllers. Literally. On PSP, the problem is that friggin' analog stick. I can control the D-pad and the normal buttons fine. It's when I had to sit there and fool around with that analog stick on there, it just hurts my thumb. But as for the normal PlayStation controller, it has not changed much since PS1 in terms of... In fact, in the layout, it's exactly the same. They've just changed it in terms of color, in terms of stiffness, and in terms of what technology's in it. And it's just a horribly uncomfortable controller for me, just because my hands are kind of weird. I was just born with a condition where I don't have a lot of flexibility in my middle fingers. So I end up having a lot of problems with the PlayStation controller. And so that's really why I hate the PlayStation, and why I can't stand playing games on it. It's not the games, it's not the system. I actually like the systems and the games. It's just that the problem is the controller. It just drives me insane. Anyway, continuing on. LaserCat FTW asks something else that I had to get translated twice, because it was like, being drunk, asking something. Yes, I am poking fun at you. I'll poke fun at you people occasionally. But, don't think anything of it. Anyway, he was asking about rogue types of games and FPS RPGs. And, what I thought about that kind of thing. Let's start with the thing I'm most familiar with, the FPS RPG genre. As far as FPS RPGs, first-person shooters mixed with role-playing games, the only one I've played that's been any real good is Deus Ex. Fallout 3 was terrible. Oblivion tried and failed miserably. And yes, I do consider those to be action games rather than role-playing games. They're nowhere near role-playing games, people. Just try to get that in your head. I understand why I'm saying that. Anyway, Borderlands did it okay, but it really feels more like Diablo than anything else, and that's one thing I hate about it. As for other first-person shooters / role-playing games, I don't know all that many. I know I is coming out eventually. It's an indie game. I know Deus Ex Human Revolution's coming up. I haven't played Invisible War yet, at least not in any particular amount of time. It crashed as soon as I started it up. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty much what I think about it. It's they don't work very well, just because they haven't found what works yet. Deus Ex worked, but not very well. The problem was that the RPG mechanics were ahead of the FPS mechanics. So you'd sit there and try to shoot something, and you'd miss it every single time you fired until you had max skill. And even then, you'd have a hard time hitting stuff. So that's the problem I have with Deus Ex, and the problem with FPS RPGs in general. It's just they either focus too much on the FPS or the RPG element. They don't try to find the best balance of the two. And once they do, it'll work fine. But as for the other types of games, he's talking about rogue types of games, like stuff that's not really been there before. He mentions Minecraft and Spelunky. Spelunky is not really a rogue type of game. It's just a platform game with a little bit of quirkiness to it. Other than that, it's really not that rogue. But Minecraft was pretty radically different, and I tried it out and didn't like it at all. It's boring as hell. I appreciate it for what it is. It is an experiment kind of thing, and that's a very good thing to have. I do firmly believe in the indie market being the place where you'll find all the innovation. Simply because, in the mainstream market, they know what sells, and therefore they're just going to go for the same stuff they've been doing over and over and over again, and it gets stale. But you go to the indie market, and they're free to do whatever they want. So you'll have games like Aquaria, or Minecraft, as much as I hate it, and even platform games like Gish, which is pretty different. But you won't have that kind of stuff in the mainstream market. So I kind of believe in the indie market for innovation. It's just that when you're doing these rogue types of games, you really have to make it fun, and a lot of them aren't that fun. So that's the problem I have with that. And there are a few that are really good, though. Another question from a string of numbers that I am way too lazy to pronounce, and I've been getting this a ton, and I hate getting asked this question, so please, people, stop asking me this. Will you be purchasing The Elder Scrolls V? No! I won't! How many times do I have to freaking say it? I will not be buying The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Why? Because it'll probably play almost exactly the same as Oblivion. I don't like Oblivion! It's boring! You just run around whacking things upside the head, and there's pretty much nothing else. There's no role-playing to it. And their big selling point is dragons. And this game is released in the same year as Dragon Age 2. I think the Dragon Age 2 is going to beat it out in the dragon department, don't you guys? Anyway, sorry about that little rant there. But I'm sick of getting asked that question. Please, people, stop asking me that. Finally, we got two more. Q.543 asks, what's your gaming rig? I get this a lot, too. So I'm just going to refer to everybody to this Q&A video whenever they ask me this. It's an 8800 GT for the graphics card. And I'll probably be upgrading in the next couple of years, because it's really starting to show its age. But Athlon 64 X2 5400 Plus at 2.8 gigahertz. It's a dual-core processor, and it does its job extremely well. And 2 gigs of RAM. Now, I can get away with that because I'm on XP, so there you go. But I will probably be upgrading eventually as soon as I really can, because right now I just can't afford it. But anyway. Finally, Chris10-ish asks, are RPGs really board games? And that's not really what I think of when I'm playing a role-playing game. Role-playing games, there are some that are board games. You see stuff like D&D is kind of a semi-board game. It's a tabletop RPG. If you're talking about a tabletop RPG, that's not actually a board game. It's just a tabletop RPG. Usually they call them pen and paper RPGs, where you have to write a lot of stuff down. But when I think of like a board game RPG, I don't really think of really anything apart from like a game with a board on it. But I think he's talking about stuff like D&D, the tabletop, and Das Schwarze Auge, the tabletop, and stuff like that. There are role-playing games that are board games, and most role-playing games are not board games, though. As far as the video game genre goes, I put together a small little thing here. This is not definitive. This is just what I've really noticed in a lot of role-playing games. They tend to be complex, and this complexity is mostly in the rule system, which is actively affecting your gameplay. So everything pretty much revolves around a rule set or a stat system, something of that nature. With a lot of games, it tends to be you have different stats like strength, dexterity, intelligence, that kind of thing, as well as different skill scores and stuff like that. And they have different modifiers that affect different things. And that's one thing that's really common in role-playing games. You don't really see it in much else, so that's pretty unique. They also tend to be long games, and the world tends to unfold around the player. And that tends to make the player a part of the world. Now, and there's a lot of role-playing games that don't do that very well either, and those end up being the really boring ones. And finally, the one thing else I've noticed is that the gameplay is generally very secondary to story and characters. This isn't really the case in dungeon crawlers, but in a lot of role-playing games in the past 10 years, like the Baldur's Gate series, Neverwinter Nights, that sort of thing, the gameplay takes a back seat to the story and the characters. So you'll end up having the character interaction really making the game worth playing and stuff like that. And that's really what role-playing games are. You play a role in the story that really just everything affects it. It's not meant to be this sort of thing where it's like, oh, well, you play a role in a first-person shooter, therefore that's a role-playing game. No, a role-playing game tends to contain all of these things that I've already mentioned and just smashes them all together. Hence why you'll say that certain games have RPG elements but aren't RPGs. So they aren't really board games. I'm kind of having a little trouble figuring out what you want with that question, but if I've answered it, then let me know. But that's pretty much all I've got for Q&A 2. Keep asking questions, and I'll come back to you guys in the next Q&A.